Where does personality come from? As with everything in psychology, genes and environment work together to determine someone's personality. Studies with twins have estimated that the heritability of personality is about 0.5. In other words, about 50% of the variation in personality across individuals in these studies could be explained by genes, and the other 50% was due to experience. However, as we discussed in the context of IQ, estimates of heritability depend on how much environmental variation is present. In the studies of the heritability of personality, the twins were mainly raised in middle-class U.S. households, so we can say that 50% of the variability in personality in middle-class U.S. households can be explained by genetic differences. However, the heritability rate might be quite a bit lower if we looked at a more variable set of environments. In addition, genes and environment interact. For example, this study found that people with the short genotype for the serotonin transporter gene showed relatively high levels of neuroticism if they had experienced generally negative life events, and relatively low levels of neuroticism if they had experienced generally positive life events. But people with the long genotype didn't show different levels of neuroticism depending on life events. So, exactly how your environment shapes your personality will depend on your genes. Studying the development of personality is challenging because it usually requires longitudinal studies in which we follow a group of people over a period of many years. If we want to know how an infant's temperament is related to an adult's personality, we'd have to study the same people from infancy through adulthood. That makes this sort of research extremely challenging. Temperament in infants and young children is the precursor of what we call personality in adults. But we can't have infants or toddlers fill out temperament surveys, so instead we give questionnaires to their parents or caregivers, observe their behavior, and measure their physiological responses. There are at least 3 main dimensions of temperament, but there isn't as much agreement about these dimensions as there is for the big 5 dimensions of adult personality. Buss and Plomin call the main 3 dimensions of temperament activity level, emotionality, and sociability. Rothbart and her colleagues have found evidence for a somewhat different set of 3 dimensions. One of their dimensions is called surgency/extroversion, which is like a combination of Buss and Plomin's activity level and sociability dimensions. Another dimension is negative affect, which is similar to Buss and Plomin's emotionality dimension. Rothbart's 3rd dimension is effortful control. This is the extent to which a child is able to focus attention and inhibit inappropriate behaviors. Buss and Plomin have added a 4th dimension of impulsivity, which is basically the same as effortful control, but labeled with the opposite end of the scale. Effortful control is often assessed using the marshmallow task, in which the child is told that if she can wait a few minutes and not eat the marshmallow, she'll actually get to eat 2 marshmallows. The amount of time a 4-year-old can wait is actually predictive of the child's grades in 8th or 9th grade. This is related to an idea that we previously discussed in the context of intelligence, namely that grades in middle school are more strongly predicted by self-discipline than by IQ. In fact, both of these findings come from the same researcher, Angela Duckworth at the University of Pennsylvania. Much research on infants and young children has focused on a dimension of temperament that's called reactivity when measured physiologically, and behavioral inhibition when measured in terms of direct observations or caregiver reports of behavior. Infants who are physiologically reactive typically have a high resting heart rate, and they'll also show an exaggerated increase in heart rate to a stimulus like a loud sound. Behaviorally, these infants will tend to move and cry more in response to a loud sound, and they'll tend to be quiet and reserved in social situations. It's useful to think of the development of personality in terms of a developmental cascade. You can imagine how different levels of reactivity will influence how a child interacts with the environment and responds to the challenges that most children face, like the first day of school or a fight with a sibling. High levels of reactivity in an infant could, in some environments, lead to adult personality characteristics such as introversion or emotional instability. In fact, infants who are physiologically reactive and behaviorally inhibited are more likely to be shy at age 4, and 3-year-olds who are highly inhibited are more likely to suffer from anxiety and depression by the age of 21. We don't yet have a complete picture of exactly how differences in temperament in infants and young children develop into differences in adult personality, because this research is extremely difficult. However, it's becoming clear that at least some aspects of temperament are related to some aspects of personality, but in a way that depends a great deal on the child's environment, including factors such as parenting styles and peer interactions.